actually very important. Mr. Trump's rage against the media is not by chance. The key to these types of illiberal, falsified democracies is the media.
Can't happen here in the United States, you may think, but it is already happening. This is the Rhyming Chaos podcast, where we interview people who have lived through or studied times of great change, when authoritarian rulers began to establish or abuse their power, or when old orders fell apart. I'm your host, Jeremy Goldkorn, coming to you from Nashville, Tennessee. Today, I am delighted and humbled to be speaking to Miklós Haraszti, a writer, journalist, human rights advocate, scholar, and erstwhile politician, who was born in Jerusalem and grew up in Hungary, where he studied philosophy and literature at Budapest University. During the late 1960s, he belonged to an left-wing student organization that opposed the ruling Hungarian Socialist Workers' Party. In 1976, he co-founded the Hungarian Democratic Opposition Movement. He participated in the negotiations on the transition to free elections in Hungary, and then was a member of the Hungarian Parliament from 1990 to 1994. After which he spent much of his time as a scholar and university professor, including at Columbia University in New York, which we will talk about, I think. He has served as a UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Belarus and as the representative on freedom of the media for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Miklós's books include A Worker in a Worker's State and The Velvet Prison. The Velvet Prison was introduced to me by Jerry Barmay, who was on the first episode of the Rhyming Chaos podcast. The book describes how the relaxation of state control of arts and culture in communist countries in the 90s did not actually bring greater freedom to the artists, but in fact was in some ways more effective than brute Stalinism in ensuring the obedience of the intellectual classes. The book helped me to understand how the apparent new freedoms of Chinese artists that I was mingling with in the 90s and early 2000s were in fact being made to serve as tools of the state. And the idea helps explain much of contemporary life in China, even now, including the gilded cage that business people and even ordinary citizens live in. Now, I fear in the United States, we're starting to see the velvet prison being erected around us. I think you can see it on the front page of the New York Times and in what is happening at Columbia University in New York. And I fear things are going to get worse. All right, welcome to Rhyming Chaos, Miklós. And I hope you will help us to understand what is happening to America right now.
I'm helping as much as I can, but I myself need some clarification.
Well, I think we all do. So to start, I always had the idea in my head that Hungary was sort of the nice communist country. I mean, my father used to tell me that Hungarians had been fairly decent to Jews during the Second World War compared with many of the neighboring countries. The Hungarians seemed noble and brave to me for the failed Hungarian Revolution of 1956 that opposed Soviet-style communism. And as a teenager, my head was turned by the novel In Praise of Older Woman by Stephen Wyszynski. I don't know how to pronounce that. And so on. And of course, you, Miklós, were a very important liberal politician in the years after communism. And it amazed and surprised me when Hungary took the illiberal turn that has happened under Orban and the democratic backsliding. Can you talk a little bit about that? Was that something that you expected? What happened in Hungary?
Well, let me introduce the subject by my very sad amazement about these turns of history, because above all ideologies, in the years of the late 80s, early 90s, we were all mesmerized by Fukuyama's theory of end of history and the idea of constant piecemeal but continuous development towards something better. And these cycles of history, the comeback of history itself, is a very sad surprise, because at the time, for example, I wrote this book about the Velvet Prison book about how directed culture in late communism did work. And then there came the unification of Hong Kong with communist China. And my plan was, rather tongue-in-cheek, go to Hong Kong and observe one more time, perhaps the last time, how a free country turns into an unfree one.
So you were as naive as me in the 1990s.
Do a kind of diary, because for sure the mighty People's China overwhelm the little and abandoned Hong Kong, and then I can produce this diary of a witness. So in my own country and in many countries actually, I see these cycles go around. And at the end of my life, not in a biological sense, but will not fit too many more experiences of this into this short life. So I'm sad about this, historically speaking. Otherwise, I'm still optimistic because of the very cycles. At least it should be cycles and not constant deterioration.
So even if you and I don't necessarily see a return to a more liberal international order, maybe our children will.
Okay, let me start with that prophecy, okay? I believe that the eastern rim of the Western civilization, or if you wish, the western rim of the former Soviet civilization, will see the light again. Maybe democracy now retreats to its original lens, but it will come again because, at least in Europe, we have these three layers of history: the Western, the Middle, and the East. And even if it's not several hundred years of experience of freedom like in the West, but in this middle rim, at least there have been at least 150 years of experimentation with democracy, which becomes flesh and blood of a nation does count. It does count, I can tell you. So this is the optimistic part. Otherwise, what happened in Hungary cannot be explained from the traditions and not even from the good beginnings as you have described them. It is an interplay of a very strong personality, a legal possibility for Bonapartism in this country. So the latter mistake, I was involved in that mistake at that negotiating table with the Communist Party, which prepared our first free election. We installed an electoral system that was miming, that was aping the Anglo-Saxon one, in that it was very, very disproportional and didn't have many guarantees. Almost as if we had been in Britain with no constitution and a super disproportional system. And that is lateral for a new democracy, for any new democracy. It's a very important lesson. Because societal variety, the multicentrism of political life disappears into a two-party system, and because in Hungary, even minimal preconditions for preserving the liberalism of the institutions and to execute the otherwise well-designed constitution were missing. Because of this, went even worse than what it could have been, because the strong personality of Viktor Orban, who is practicing Machiavellism, did its worst for our country. What we have now is a country without any originally free nation, with absolutely no radio station where you could have a debate. Generally speaking, a country without debate. Parliament is a total rubber stamp institution. There are no independent controlling institutions. Viktor Orban installed a system where his appointees serve for 9 years and consecutive if you don't have a 2/3 in parliament to continue to elect a new one. It is a total disgrace, as your president likes to say. And at the moment, the only hope is that the different opposition parties could get themselves together and somehow master a force that is a match for the ruling party's avalanche. It is an avalanche because on the go, Viktor Orban has changed several times the electoral law from disproportional to even more disproportional. So in the last elections, he wins 70% majority in parliament with 30 or 40% of the votes. It's that disproportional, and that explains everything.
And that does sound rather familiar right now in the United States.
I was thinking about the parallel, and I can tell you that President Trump has invented an equivalent of the mechanism that Viktor Orban installed in our country. If it is the disproportional electoral law and the unicameral parliament which decides about everything, and he can rule as a quasi-parliamentarian democracy because one vote in his parliament is enough to change the constitution, which he did change several times in the last 15 years, several times. The equivalent of that mechanism in Mr. Trump's hands is the litigation process in your country. He can ignore courts, he can ignore rulings, he can ignore established mechanism and even the constitution, because after a while on the litigation line, the issue goes up to Supreme Court, which is his. And that's what will, he hopes, work the way in Orban's Hungary, the unicameral supermajority works in parliament.
The thing that's supposed to be the check and balance will, in fact, let him do what he wants instead of providing a check on his power.
No, the checks and balances in your constitutional system would work if the different levels of institutions, the president's office included, will hold themselves to those established rules. But if he does not, then very complicated litigation system starts in the United States, which ends up at the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court works as the unicameral supermajority in Hungary's parliament and basically approves what the president did because it is that president who named those justices.
Right.
The point is that he can afford to ignore the established checks and balances. And that's the same in its final result, is the same what we have in Hungary. And I heard, as you must have heard, that actually Viktor Orban did play a tutor for Trumpism in the last years, that his method of transforming the country from above with the help of the state machinery is the basic lesson that Viktor Orban has taught to Trump's people, and that doesn't promise much good, actually.
Yeah. I think in 2011, I saw an interview with you that was done in, I think it was 2011, and you said at that time that Hungary had become the first fully fledged illiberal democracy in the European Union. And I think you blamed, or you referred to the systematic removal of checks and balances. So that was 2011. When did you become aware that this was happening in Hungary? What were the first signs that things were going on this path?
Well, actually, in the very first moment, you could notice that Viktor Orban was in opposition for 8 years before his takeover in 2010. And the very first law, in fact, a very thick package of laws about the media, which he, in a ready-made fashion, has tabled with Parliament the very first moment. And it was total takeover. Total takeover. That was the famous media. Actually, very important. Mr. Trump's rage against the media is not by chance. The key to these types of illiberal, falsified democracies is the media. So he established a 5-member board over all media in the country, solely delegated by his party, and a total dictatorship over media licensing, over delicensing, very importantly. And now we ended up in a country, we ended up very early, after 2010, in a country where there is absolutely no legacy media which the opposition could use. There is one print daily where opposition can appear. There is no TV and no radio where opposition can appear. It's solely online where opposition can have a voice. Of course, there is a constant ongoing encroaching on the online media as well.
Is there an attempt to actually censor the internet in the way that China does in Hungary at the moment? Or has that not happened yet?
I think the membership of the European Union does count in that respect. There are constant efforts to constrain, to reduce, to ban this and that, but basically it does work. The greatest danger over the online media is actually the financial one, because the undescribable great universe of propaganda machinery that Viktor Orban has comes for free to the public, while obviously the independent online media has to be paid by the users. So the crowdfunding is a constant crisis, plus the independent media editorial boards themselves are not on the top of the job when it comes to paywall. They do it separately in competition with one another, and doesn't bode well. Obviously, long ago they should have invented somehow a common pool of financing, which they don't do because of the lag, because they only slowly understand that we are not living in a democracy anymore. And they want to do their job as normal journalists do in a normal European country. And that is upholding their own independence and their own quality journalism. But it cannot subsumate into a public opinion. It cannot become universally known knowledge what they do. And even if sometimes they publish wonderful investigative journalism, it disappears beyond payroll.
Nobody's reading it. At least intellectuals maybe, or concerned people, but ordinary people are not going to see it.
Well, it's difficult to define what ordinary people, but you can define it geographically and in terms of income level. And let's say the countryside, the small village archipelago of Hungary. And there, what you have is just a legacy media, the kind of media which comes for free. And there you get propaganda and propaganda and propaganda. A totally binary, good, bad. Good is government, bad is opposition. And it would still be okay if the news of opposition would somehow transpire, but they do not. It's just calumnies and libel and untruths and fake news.
And how far does the sort of oppression of free expression and thought extend? I mean, you're in Hungary, you're in your country house. Are you ever worried that armed men will come to your door and take you away? Or how much velvet is there in the prison you're in Hungary right now?
Wonderful question. It's velvetier than the erstwhile prison of late liberal communism. Please take it seriously, the adjective illiberal. It's just a falsified democracy purposefully, where 2/3 in parliament is more powerful than 100% was in communist power. It is almighty. And they simply don't need armed men sent to opposition houses. They don't need it. Media is the very, very first thing. And then come the reglementation of all economy, soft nationalization in the hands of the government and its chosen oligarchs, everything that is important. So beware of the oligarch, under Trumpism, because he too doesn't need to send armed people. It is enough if the economy is controlled by people who are in his service.
It's like the line from The Godfather where, we don't like violence, we're just doing business.
Very much so. So it is the art of how to suppress any kind of possibility of innovation in a country where you still have a multi-owner economy and nominally multi-party democracy in parliament. And those opposition parties are really there. Only trouble is that they are totally fragmented and they cannot unite because 10 years of it was not enough for them to understand that even if you are left-wing and the other is right-wing and the next one is green, they do have a common denominator which is called democracy. They believe they should do business as democracies do. And that's a very powerful inhibition that is used by the illiberal ruler of the country. Now, ultimate checks and balances, which is the term limit in the US, does not exist in my country. So that's also very powerful that the recreation of democracy that should come almost automatically with the term limit does not exist in a European parliamentary democracy.
Right. Well, I'm not that confident that it's going to prove to be a check or a balance in this country, to be honest. I mean, it might not be Donald Trump, maybe it's his son Barron, but I feel as though we're being set up for a long-term rule by the current regime. We're talking about oligarchs. Is there somebody who's roughly equivalent to Elon Musk in Hungary?
There is one. It is the childhood pal of Viktor Orbán from his humble village. His name is Lőrinc Mészáros, and in 5 years, he became Hungary's guaranteed nobody in terms of financial might. He became Hungary's richest person. And it is just taken for granted. It is taken for a fact. Nobody needs to check that he is just a strawman. He's a strawman for Orbán. It is his neighbor from the village. And now as Orbán's family is becoming richer and richer, and this Mészáros guy is transferring assets to Orbán's family more and more, it is now seems as proven. Very important to understand that corruption, meaning, how do you call it? Nepotism, it's called, right? Okay. So point is, Yes, we have an oligarch who is an equivalent of being the, if not wealthiest person of the world, like your Mr. Musk, but that of Hungary, and he owns all relevant businesses in Hungary.
Right. Sounds what you describe is sort of like in China, they call it a white glove. He's the person who Orban can be extremely rich without having to technically own.
No, it's actually a farce. Parliamentarians have to declare their wealth every year, and Orban is the one with the least asset in the whole political class. So it is almost kind of black humor on his part, just defying your credulence by declaring zero assets, while his family is undescribably rich. His daughters, his son-in-law, his wife, his father, all of them are billionaires out of the nowhere, while he declares zero assets. And this cynical black humor is what you have to live with instead of clarity and instead of transparency.
Right. It's the guy with 2 cents in the bank account, but his wife has a gold toilet and a yacht.
And even a gold toilet brush.
So why do you think the American right has fallen in love with Viktor Orban? Is it just because they see him as a model for how to rule and pillage the country? I don't know. I'm not really amazed by anything anymore, but for a while, I couldn't understand how people who had previously been apparently against the kind of values that Orban represented have fallen so far in love with him.
I'm sorry, what part you don't understand? How Orban could change or how can Trump love him?
Well, what the American right saw in Orban, I guess.
I believe the most enticing part of Orban's teachings is how to handle the cultural war. Because the greatest sorrow of the Trumpians is the power of the free press, is the power of the civil society, is the power of the tradition of criticism. And Orban did find a method how to fight that. And in 2 words, it is from above. From above. Because all right-wing, all previous right-wing sides of the spectrum tried to fight that soft power of the intelligentsia from below, one by one, or by debate, or whatever. And it doesn't work. The debate remains. And what is painful for the Trumpians is debate itself. So how to eliminate debate? And the way to do it is from above with the help of the state power. You have to conquer the top of the state and from then on going down and suppress variety and suppress criticism. That's where Orban's example is very powerful.
Right. That makes sense. You taught at Columbia University in New York, and I don't know how closely you've been following the developments there. What do you make of what's happening at Columbia University?
Well, in my time, it was the very beginning of the 10th, so it was 2010 and 11 up to 14. I had a course there, actually joint course with President Bollinger about free speech, and he was the light and I was the shadow, because he educated about First Amendment in America and I taught about censorship in the world. But these times now are different. Actually, I think what is going on in the universities since a number of years was not positive. So the Trumpians came in my was the suppression by a certain variation of left-wing suppression of free speech. And that is very, very handily usable by the Trumpians to suppress variety, this time fully, or this time totally control what is going on there, as we see in the news. Clearly, they miss that disappointment, which I think understandably is present in many observers. Actually, what happened during the Israeli-Palestinian, Israeli-Hamas conflict rather reminded me very much the Cultural Revolution of China in 1966. Was not positive at all. So maybe if you wish and you don't like this for your own, you can cut this part. What happened there in Columbia now in the universities now, exactly as I said, using state power to suppress independence and autonomy of universities is using or misusing something that was not positive itself.
I think this is one of the keys to understanding what has been happening in the United States.
The way they do it is exactly the Orban way, using state power to deprive universities of their autonomy. which is a very important issue in Hungary. With the exception of very few universities, already succeeded. The way Orban does it is moving state universities into private hands, into hands of foundations, curatoria, the members of which are, of course, named by him, and for good. And then it's said, you want autonomy? These curatoria will be fully autonomous, and they will define in the future who will be their successor. So it is for good in Orbanists' hands. For good, the European Union is fighting that method and has deprived Hungary from some funding because of that issue, because of the autonomy of universities issue. So it's an ongoing fight. But certainly what Trump did after the actually inconvenient movements in universities and misusing those who misused university autonomy is following the Orban.
Just to drill down on that, I mean, what you're talking about is that American universities, Columbia perhaps most famously now, there was a kind of on the right wing, they'd call it like woke censorship, I suppose. There was an atmosphere where certain points of view were not welcome because they didn't fit with a certain left-leaning ideology. And this was, in fact, a bad thing for academic freedom.
It was intimidating.
It was intimidating. And, one example, I suppose, of that mindset was the firing of Ian Baruma, who was the editor of the New York Review of Books, because he had dared to publish a piece by a guy who had been accused of sexual harassment. And people on the right wing were comparing that to the Cultural Revolution in China. And, there was some justification for that. So that was bad. And this has then been seized upon by the Trumpists as a justification for a much more serious crackdown on freedom of academic inquiry and expression. Am I understanding correctly what you're saying?
Very much so. In Hungary, you didn't have such a terror of the left, quote unquote. You didn't have any kind of intimidation. It was simply universities, academia as its best, with all kinds of researches. And actually, after a decade of urbanism, universities have remained a kind of island of keen observation, of fresh research, and he just didn't want to have that. So he used state power to forcibly move universities into the private hands of foundations that he founded. And the skeleton of that method, again, that you use state power from above to suppress unwanted variety in society, is what Trump method has found an equivalent.
Right. Can we go back to, you talked about how the opposition parties and politicians in Hungary are they're not united. They have ideological differences, political differences, and those differences sort of get in the way of them actually uniting against the illiberal Orbanists. And that seems to me to be quite similar to what's happening inside the Democratic Party in the United States, where you have a lot of politicians who are still operating under the assumptions that this is a normal democracy and that their behavior should be similar to the behavior a decade or two ago, and that they can use the institutions of the American democratic system to pursue their aims, and it's preventing them from being able to actually do anything effective. Does that make sense? And you talk a little bit more about how that dynamic operates in Hungary.
I have to return first to the question of electoral system, because the Anglo-Saxon electoral system, which is a majoritarian system, which practically produces a two-party system instead of a multi-party system, and the must to cut coalitions and variety of different audiences expressed via the party system, that doesn't exist in Hungary either. The problem is that, as I told you, and I am partly culpable for that as part of the team that negotiated in 89-90 the transition to democracy, we have installed that disproportional system, which practically is a two-party system, but if you still have very varied and fragmented opposition, then it's just a domination of one party, which can unite the ruling party in this sense. So I believe that, especially in the US, where you nevertheless still have the term limits, and you know that you will get a chance in 4 years' time to do something with the help of the other party at least. There, the question is much more decided by the fact you have a leading personality or not, especially in times of modern media. It's more and more about leading, uniting personality. And yeah, I know that the far left in the Democratic Party and the mainstream in the Democratic Party cannot agree, and that weakens that party. But what really weakens that party is that it lacks one uniting personality, and that was very clearly the case with the late presidency of Biden. That was painful. But our conditions still exist, and I believe that the Democratic Party can do much better if they find a uniting personality. It is in the US, under US condition, in my observation, is a much more important question than the fragmentation inside the party.
The politics is driven by charisma, and the Democratic Party is, maybe there's Bernie Sanders or AOC, but they don't have a Barack Obama right now, is the problem.
You have to have somebody who is a uniter, but she or he must come from the future, not from the past.
And they got to look good on TV.
It's funny that we are going back, to the Pharaoh's time in that respect. Modern media brings us back to the beginnings of politics. Yeah, you have to shine.
All right, let me ask you one last question, Miklós. What's your advice for Americans now?
Well, it's kind of immodest. How do you say, what's the word?
Immodest?
Immodest. It's too immodest to pretend I have an advice. For sure, America has been inspiration for our generation of democratizers, and I wish the electoral system, the disproportional electoral system, it should have opted for a classic European multi-party democracy with very difficult formation of a government and a very easy disbandment of a government and coalitions and compromises. You see very similar countries in the post-communist world like Poland or the Czech lands or Slovakia or Romania or Bulgaria. They too have their wannabe dictators, but they cannot get through because the electoral system is forcing coalitions and does not allow for a total victory like the disproportional electoral system. Sorry for talking so much about this, but institutions do count and constitutions do count. So my point is, first you have to defeat somehow Trump and then think as a great lesson, as a ground lesson about this experiment with illiberalism. And even on the brink of dictatorship in your great country, you have to think on a reform, how to make into a more Canadian direction with the party system, which seems to be a quite efficient problem for dictators.
Miklós, it's truly been my honor to talk to you, and thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us, unfortunately about rather grim topics. The Rhyming Chaos podcast is produced by me, Jeremy Goldcorn, and edited by Kadra Scripts. The theme music is Eric Satie's Gymnopédie No. 1, arranged and performed by Wu Fei. Our cover art is by Lian Fei. Please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Leave us a review, and if you like what we're doing, please take out a paid subscription at rhymingchaos.com. Thank you, Miklós.
Thank you, Jeremy.